kiln was still warm when my brother called to tell me I wasn't allowed to speak at our mother's funeral. I had my hands in a bucket of slip clay, elbow deep, smoothing the wall of a memorial urn I'd been throwing since 5 that morning. The urn was for her. I placed it in the deep river green she always said reminded her of the creek behind the house in Asheville where she grew up. My phone buzzed against the workbench, rattling a row of trimming tools, and I wiped one wrist on my apron and tapped speaker because my hands were a mess. Hey, I said, I'm the stereo. Of course you are. That tone. I know it anyway. My older brother had a way of saying the most ordinary things so it landed like a verdict. Listen, the service is Saturday at 11. We're keeping it simple. Tight. Okay, I'm bringing the urn. It's almost done. That's the thing. We talked it over and we think it's better if you don't get up to speak. I stopped. The wheel was still spinning under my idle foot, the clay wobbling, and I let it fall out of round without caring. What do you mean don't speak? I mean my wife is doing the eulogy. She's good at that kind of thing. She did one at her own dad's funeral, and people cried. She knows how to read a room. And honestly, sis, you'd get up there and turn it into a whole therapy session about your feelings. Mime's friends don't need that. Let's just keep it clean. I remember the exact texture of the silence after that. The hum of the keen. The drip of the faucet I'd never gotten around to fixing. 40 years old and I was being told, 3 days before I buried my mother, that I was a liability at her funeral. If you've ever been handed a script for your own family that you never agreed to act in, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Tell me in the comments how old you are and what state you're watching from tonight, because I want to know who's out there. This is Scarlet Vengeance, and I promise you, you are going to want to stay until the very end of this one. I didn't yell. That's the part people never believe. A younger version of me would have screamed until my throat gave out, would have begged him to understand. But I'd run out of begging somewhere on my 35th birthday, when I finally accepted that you cannot argue someone into loving you correctly. All right, I said. My voice came out flat and even, and I heard him exhale, relieved, the way you exhale when a problem solves itself. Good, I knew you'd get it. You've always been the reasonable one. He paused. Oh, and the urn. Eve's got it covered. Her sister does these beautiful arrangements, marble, real classy, so you don't need to bring the pottery thing. Mom would have wanted something nicer anyway. The pottery thing. The urn I had cried into the clay off. I looked at it sitting on the shelf, that green like creek water in August, and I said, sure, whatever's easiest. He hung up first. He always hung up first. Here's what you need to understand about my family, because none of the rest makes sense without it. My brother married up, or he married into the appearance of up, which in my family was the same thing. His wife came from people who had a lake house and a boat, and a way of mentioning both within 4 minutes of meeting you. Her father, before he passed, had owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 counties, and my brother had gone to work for the family business and slid into a life that was paid for by someone else's name on the building, and my parents loved it. God, they loved it. My mother, who raised us in a 2-bedroom rental in a mill town where everybody's daddy worked at the same plant, suddenly had a son who summered places. She got invited to the lake house. She got a designer handbag every Christmas that she kept the dust cover for. She would call me and spend 20 minutes on what my brother and his wife had done, the renovation, the trip to Napa, and then say, anyway, how's the little art business? In a voice that made it clear the call was nearly over. The little art business. I know ceramic studio near a converted feed store outside Chattanooga. I sell to galleries in Atlanta and Nashville. I teach workshops that book out months ahead. And the year before all this happened, I'd shipped a 16-piece commission to a hotel group that paid me more than my brother made in a quarter. My mother never knew that number. She never asked. To her, I was the daughter who played with mud while her son did real things with real money. I learned a long time ago where the warm seat in our family was, and it was never going to be mine. When I was 9, I won the regional spelling bee, drove 90 minutes to the county seat, stood on a stage in a church basement and spelled chrysanthemum, while 2 folding chairs sat empty in the 4th row because my brother had a travel baseball game the same afternoon. My mother told me later they'd meant to come for the second half, There wasn't a second half. You either win or you go home. I stopped expecting the chairs to fill somewhere around 11. But you never really stop hoping. That's the cool part nobody tells you. The hope just goes underground and waits. So when the phone went dark in my Clay Streak studio, I didn't feel shock. I felt the old familiar floor of it, the place I always landed. And then I felt something newer, something that had been growing roots in me for a few years now, quiet and hard. I picked the phone back up and I texted the one person who had never once made me feel like the second chair. His name was on my screen as just a first name. No surname, the way you save someone you talk to every day. I'll call him my husband because that's what he became. But at the time, he was the man I'd been with for 3 years and married at the courthouse the spring before with 2 studio assistants as our witnesses and barbecue afterward. My family had not come to that either. My house said you didn't even have a real wedding, and I had said no, mom, I had a real one, just a small one, and she had changed the subject to my brother's anniversary party. To my family, my husband was a contractor. That's what they called him, the contractor. He showed up to the 2 holidays he was ever invited to in clean work boots and a flannel, because that's what was comfortable. And my brother had looked him up and down once and asked if he did decks. He was thinking about a deck. What my family never bothered to find out was that the man they called the contractor had started with one crew and a single flip in a town nobody wanted to live in. And by the time I met him, he held a land under half the new development on the east side of the county, plus 2 strip centers and a self-storage operation that printed money in its sleep. He drove a 15-year-old truck because he liked the truck. He could have bought my brother's whole life out of pocket and not noticed it leave the account. I texted him. They told me I can't speak at her funeral. Eve's doing the eulogy. The 3 dots came up right away. Then they stopped. Then my phone rang. He didn't say sorry. He didn't get loud. He said, "What do you need from me? Tell me, and it's done." And I sat there on a stool in my studio with my dead mother's urn glowing green on the shelf, and I started, for the first time in 3 days, to cry. Not from the grief. I'd grieved her for years, honestly. The slow grief of loving someone who can't love you back the right way. I cried because somebody had asked me what I needed, and I genuinely could not remember the last time anyone in my family had. "I don't know," I told him. "I think I need to just go and sit in the back and let them have it." There was a long quiet. Then he said, "You can do that. Or you can let me make one phone call and you'll never have to ask anyone for permission again." I should tell you about the second person who showed up, because she's the reason any of this turned the way it did. 2 days before the funeral, I was at the studio glazing a backup lid for the urn I wasn't allowed to bring, when a car I didn't recognize came up the gravel. Not fancy. A practical sedan, the kind a person buys when they've stopped needing to prove anything. A woman got out, somewhere in her late 60s, silver haircut, blunt at the jaw, in a charcoal blazer and good loafers. She stood looking at my sign for a second like she was confirming she had the right place. I came out wiping my hands. "Help you." "You're the one who made the heron platter," she said. Not a question. The one at the inn up in Blowing Rock? I'd made that platter 4 years earlier. A big oval thing, a great blue heron in cobalt against bone white, for a small luxury inn that a friend of mine had decorated. I did. My late husband and I had our 40th anniversary dinner under it, she said. He died that winter. I went back and bought the platter off the wall. I've been trying to find who made it ever since. She put out her hand. I run a foundation. We fund regional arts, among other things. We talked for an hour. I made her bad studio coffee in a mug I'd seconded for a chip. She told me she built and sold a regional bank before she was 50, and now she gave the money away on purpose because she'd watched too many people, her own family included, spend their whole lives confusing a bank with a soul. When she found out I'd buried my husband's people and my own people all in the same county, she went still. "And your mother just passed," she said. "The local arts world is small. Word travels." "I'm sorry. They told me I can't speak at the service," I said, and I don't know why I told her, a stranger. Except that she had the kind of face you tell things to. "My brother's wife is doing it," she set the chipped mug down very gently. "Is that so?" I want to be careful here because the easy version of this story is the one where the women cackle and plot revenge. And that's not what happened. What happened was quieter, and it cut deeper. She asked me what my mother had actually been like, the real woman, not the one who kept a dust cover on the handbag. And I told her. I told her about the creek in Asheville, and how my mother could name every wildflower on a roadside, and how before the lake house and the designer Christmases she used to sing while she hung laundry, and how somewhere along the way she traded all of that for a seat at a table that was never really hers. The woman from the foundation listened to all of it. Then she said, "You're going to speak at that funeral, not because anyone gives you permission, because it's the truth, and the truth doesn't ask." The day before the service, my brother's wife called me. We had never once had a real conversation, the two of us, in 8 years. She called to, in her words, make sure we were all on the same page. "I just think it'll be smoother," she said, "if there aren't any surprises. I've got the eulogy handled. I'm doing a whole thing about how Mom," she called my mother Mom, which she had started doing at some point without asking, and which I had never gotten used to. About how Mom brought the family together. About legacy. "It's really beautiful. Everyone's going to love it." "I'm sure they will," I said. "And listen." Her voice dropped into the confidential register people use right before they are about to take something from you. "Your brother and I were talking, and with everything, the estate stuff, it's just going to be a lot. So we think it makes sense for him to be executor. You got your hands full with the studio. We'll handle everything. You don't have to lift a finger." There it was. The eulogy was the appetizer. This was the meal. My mother didn't have a fortune, but she had the house, the little Milltown house she'd somehow held on to, and the life insurance policy, and 40 years of small things. And they wanted it run through them, the way everything in our family ran through them, so they could decide what trickled back to me, if anything did. "You've thought of everything," I said. "We really have. So you're good with all this?" "I'm good," I said, with whatever Mom actually wanted. A tiny pause. "Right? Well, we're all just trying to honor her." I hung up and I looked at the green urn, and I made my one phone call after all, not to my husband, to the woman from the foundation who had given me a card with a cell number on it and said, "Use it." "Tell me something," I said. "If a person wanted to make sure the truth got said out loud in a room with witnesses and no one could stop it once it started, how would they do that?" I heard her smile through the phone. "Honey," she said, "you just show up and you stand up. The trick isn't getting permission. The trick is being the kind of person nobody in that room can afford to interrupt." Saturday came grey and still, the kind of southern autumn morning where the fog sits in the low places and won't burn off. The funeral was at the church my mother had started attending after she got fancy. A big brick one with a paved lot and a sound system. Not the little white clapboard one she'd actually been baptized in. My brother had picked it. Of course he had. I got there early. I wore my mother's color, that creek green, a simple dress, and I carried nothing in my hands because they'd told me not to bring the urn. The marble one was up front already, gleaming and cold and wrong, full of a woman it had never known. I sat in the back, third row from the doors, off to the side, exactly where they'd have put me if they'd drawn a map. My brother was up front in a dark suit, shaking hands, working the room like a wake was a networking event. His wife stood near the casket spray in a black dress that cost more than my mother's first car, accepting condolences with a practiced little tilt of the head. And then the doors at the back opened and the air in the room changed. It wasn't loud. That's what I keep coming back to. There was no announcement. A few people came in quietly and took seats, but they were not people anyone in that church had expected. The woman from the foundation, in charcoal again with two others I didn't know but who carried that same unmistakable weight. The kind of people who own the building before you realize it's for sale. A man my husband knew, who sat on the board of the regional hospital my mother had been treated in, the hospital that had a wing my husband's company had quietly helped fund. The president of the Arts Council, a reporter from the regional magazine that had run a piece on the inn with my head on platter in the photo, and my husband, in a dark suit, which I'd almost never seen him in, looking like exactly what he was, which was the most solvent man in the building by a margin nobody in my family could have imagined. My brother saw them filing in, and I watched him do the math wrong, the same way our father always had. He straightened his tie. He leaned to his wife and I could read his lips. Investors or important, something like that. He thought these people had come because of him. He thought the room had finally filled up with the kind of audience he'd spent his whole life trying to deserve. And he had no idea, none, that every single one of them had come for the daughter sitting in the third row from the back. The service started. The pastor spoke, generic and warm. There was a hymn. And then my brother's wife rose, smoothed her dress, and walked to the lectern with a folded paper and began to read a eulogy about a woman I did not recognize. A matriarch, a bringer together of family. There was a line about the bridge between all of us, and a line about her greatest joy was watching her children thrive. And the whole thing was so smooth and so empty that I felt the green urn I hadn't been allowed to bring like an ache in my arms. She finished. People nodded. My brother dabbed his eye with a knuckle, performing. And in the small silence before the pastor could move things along, I stood up. I didn't rush. I walked up the center aisle in my cream green dress, and I felt every head turn, and I felt my brother's whole body go rigid in the front pew. He half rose. He actually started to lift out of his seat to stop me, his mouth opening to say something, and that's when it happened. The woman from the foundation stood up too. Just stood in the second row, calm as Sunday, and looked at him. And the man from the hospital board shifted in his seat. And the president of the Arts Council folded her hands and looked at the front of the room expectantly. And my husband sat with his forearms on his knees, watching my brother with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who has all the time and all the leverage in the world. My brother looked around at these people he thought were his. And he understood, in the space of about 2 seconds, that if he made a scene right now, if he physically stopped his sister from speaking at their mother's funeral, he would be doing it in front of every person whose good opinion he had ever wanted. He sat back down. The color went out of his face the way water goes out of a cracked basin. He sat down and he let me pass. I reached the lectern. I didn't have a folded paper. I looked out at the room, at the people who'd come for me and the people who'd never seen me clearly, and at the cold marble urn, and I started to talk about my actual mother. I told them about the creek in Asheville. I told them she could name every white flower on a roadside, chicory and Queen Anne's lace, and the orange one she called butterfly weed. I told them how she sang when she hung laundry, an old gospel number, and how when I was small I thought my mother had been a singer, a real one, because that's how it sounded to a kid in the yard. I told them she taught me that you make a thing with your hands and you sign your name to it, and that's how you stay alive after you're gone. I didn't say one word about my brother. I didn't say one word about lake houses. I just gave them her, the real one, the one underneath the dust cover. And I watched her old friends, the Milltown friends who'd somehow gotten invited, start to cry because they recognized her. For the first time that whole morning, somebody in that room had told the truth. When I finished, I walked back down the aisle and I did not look at the front pew, and the silence held until I sat down, and then it broke into the kind of quiet that's better than applause. The rest came fast, and it came clean, and not one bit of it was anything I had to force. It turned out my mother had a will. A real one, made 4 years before she died, with a lawyer in town my brother had never heard of. She'd made it, I'd learn, after a visit to my studio she never told anyone about. A visit where she sat on a stool and watched me throw a bowl and said almost nothing, and then drove home and called a lawyer. She'd left the house to me, not split, to me, with a note in her own handwriting that the lawyer read at the reading, with my brother sitting across the table, gone grey again, and the note said she knew she hadn't always seen me, and that she was sorry, and that the house had a creekstone fireplace, and she wanted it to go to the child who understood where she came from. My brother contested it, of course, for about a month, until his own lawyer explained what it would cost and what it would look like, and until certain people in the county whose respect he depended on for the dealership business made it quietly clear they'd seen exactly who stood up at that funeral and who tried to sit her back down. The family business was his wife's family's business, and her family did not love a public mess. He dropped it. He sent me a one-line email. "We're family. I hope we can move past this." I never answered it. Some doors you don't slam, you just stop walking back to check if they reopened. I kept the house. I gave the green urn its place on the creek stone mantel, and I scattered most of my mother in Asheville by the water in the spring when the butterfly weed was coming up orange along the bank. The foundation funded a scholarship in my mother's name for kids in mill towns who make things with their hands. I run the workshop for it myself every summer. The marble urn, I have no idea where it went. It was never really hers. People will tell you that time heals everything, and I think that's the thing we say to each other, because the truth is harder to fit on a sympathy card. Time didn't heal me. What healed me was the day I finally stopped auditioning for a part in a family that had already cast someone else, stood up without asking, and found out that the room I'd been afraid of had never had any real power over me at all. The chairs in the fourth row stayed empty my whole childhood. I spent 40 years staring at them. And then one grey morning, I turned around and realized the only seat that had ever mattered was the one I was standing up out of. If you've got an empty chair you've been waiting on your whole life, hear me. You are allowed to stop waiting. You are allowed to stand up and say the true thing in your own voice, in your own time, and let the people who never saw you watch you walk up that aisle. Tell me your story down below. I read every single one because yours matters too, and I promise you the quiet on the far side of that door is worth every year it costs to reach it. The empty chairs in that fourth row followed me for 40 years, and it took me almost that long to understand they were never going to fill, no matter how perfectly I spelled a word on the stage. I kept performing for a panel of judges who had already left the building. That's the thing nobody warns you about a family like mine. You don't get hurt once. You get hurt slowly, over decades, in 1,000 small rooms, until you start to believe the smallness is just the shape you are. Daniel didn't go pale at that funeral because of money. He went pale because for 1 second he saw himself clearly, and so did everyone whose opinion he'd spent his life chasing. That's how cause and effect actually works in families. You can rearrange the seating, you can hand the eulogy to the right person, you can keep the dust cover on the handbag, but you cannot fake the truth in a room full of people who can feel it. Eve read a beautiful speech about a woman who didn't exist. I stood up and gave them my mother, and the room knew the difference instantly. The truth doesn't need a microphone, it just needs one person willing to stand. I think about what it really took to get up out of that pew, and it wasn't anger. Anger is loud and it's lazy. What it took was 3 things I had to grow on my own because no one handed them to me. It took refusing to lie about who my mother was, even when lying would have been smoother, because doing the right thing when it costs you something is the only kind of right that counts. It took being smart enough to stop arguing with people who only respect leverage and instead quietly build a life so solid that one morning I simply didn't need their permission anymore. And it took the plain stubborn strength to keep making things with my hands in a feed store outside Chattanooga, while the people I loved called it playing in the mud. Nobody claps for the years you spend building roots in the dark. But the roots are what hold you when the wind finally comes. If you're sitting in your own back row tonight, waiting for someone to call you up to the front, I want you to hear me. You can keep waiting, or you can become a person so honest, so capable, and so quietly unbreakable that the room rearranges itself around you. Myren didn't win because she got revenge. She won because she stopped auditioning. Build the character that does what's right when it's hard. Get wise enough to see the game and stop playing it, and then stand up in your own voice and say the true thing. The empty chair was never the problem. The problem was how long I let it tell me where to sit.